More than a decade ago, the iconic New York dance band LCD Sound System released what might be described as the ultimate hipster nostalgia song. I'm Losing My Edge spoke specifically to my own somewhat obscure generation of house and disco heads who had grown up in the 80s and 90s, frequenting underground loft and warehouse parties across the Rust Belt and East Coast, confident we embodied the avant-garde. At these events, musicians mixed together the latest electronic compositions, sometimes so fresh that they existed only as test pressings from the record factory, with nuggets of vinyl that they had scrounged like archaeologists from obscure music stores, their parents' basements, and garage sales. Under the musical tutelages of people like Detroit's Moody Man, Kenny Dixon Jr., we were treated to performances that blended together music stretching the globe. The disco greats Sylvester's Sweet Celebration, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, could be interrupted by a selection of Afrobeat from South Africa, Berlin's minimal techno, or Motown from the Motor City. Sometimes even Donna Summers made an appearance. Over in the corner, you could find dancers taking a break from the dancing while reflecting on what the composer Jean Cage or the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy might have said about it all. If you were very lucky, you might hear a musician taking a pause in their artistry to offer up a discourse on how we're educating you for the future. Everybody thought they were so very, very cool. LCD Sound System's I'm Losing My Edge paid homage or perhaps made fun of all of this. After a moment of almost discordant noise, the track opens with the droning monologue over a simple hypnotic beat. Yeah, I'm losing my edge. I'm losing my edge. The kids are coming up from behind. I'm losing my edge to the kids from France and from London, but I was there. At the phrase, but I was there, the song adds a layer, gets more complicated, and then James Murphy, LCD Sound System singer, proceeds with a list of events in the evolution of dance and music and modern art that are both frighteningly obscure and impossible for any single person to have attended. I used to work at the record store. I had everything before anyone. I was there in the Paradise Garage DJ booth with Larry Levan. I was there in Jamaica with the great sound clashes. I woke up naked on the beach of Ibiza in 1988. He intones very wistfully before hesitatingly admitting, but I'm losing my edge, to better-looking people with better ideas and more talent. And they're actually really, really nice. The song then moves on to Murphy reflecting not on all the places where he could claim, but I was there, but to a rather confused series of statements that begin, I hear. I hear that you and your band have sold your guitars and brought turntables. I hear that you and your band have sold turntables and bought guitars. I hear that everybody you know is more relevant than everybody that I know. It's a brilliant composition. It captures some of the central dynamics of what it means to live in these times. Indeed, I suspect it captures something of what it means to be creatures who are aware of the past, living in the present, and aging into the future. To live in a society that places the highest premium on the new at the expense of the old. The new iPhone, the new Tesla, the new gadget, the new, the what have you done lately? I suspect to live that in such society is to live in the fear that either now or in sometime in the future we will be all used up, to quote the folk singer Utah Phillips. It's to live in a situation where at some point, no matter our age, we may find ourselves mourning the past, looking back to what has been, longing for a time when we felt more comfortable or more relevant than we do today. Now, this is the third in our series of sermons on reimagining grief. At the beginning of the month, Scott talked to us about how grieving is a healing process, and it's learning to live with loss. Last week, I continued our series with a meditation on grieving the future. We live in a time when we're grieving not only what has been, but the losses we anticipate are coming. Facing the catastrophe of the climate crisis, I suggested we can give up hope, or we can choose to live in faith that life and love will continue. This week, we proceed with a sermon on mourning the past. Now, it might seem odd to offer you words on mourning the past after having a sermon on grieving the future. The past, we like to think, is whatever comes before the present and before the future. The future is, of course, imagined in contrast as to whatever will come next. It's one of my hopes, however, that in our work of reimagining grief, we can discard such a linear narrative. In doing so, I want to offer you a path around what I think is the false dichotomy offered by the narrator in I'm Losing My Edge. The viewpoint that we are relevant and then become irrelevant is both decidedly a secular and consumeristic one. The secular and consumeristic viewpoint can cause us as we age to hearken back to the glory days when I was there and fear that someday someone will replace us. Being part of a religious community like First Houston, however, offers us the radical opportunity to reject such a dichotomy. It is to transcend that fear spoken of by Walter Lippmann of always being discontented and hearkening for what was while fearing what is to come. For it provides us a chance to be part of a communion that stretches across time and is greater than any of us. It gifts us with the ability to reimagine grief and life, for in a religious community, we can come to understand the gifts and the love that we give the world endure beyond ourselves. Let me explain. Grief is not a linear process. It does not begin at one point and then end at another. As Scott told us, when we reimagine grief, we embrace the emotional truth. There is no right way to grieve, except for the way that is right for you. Sometimes that means we find ourselves looking towards the future. At other times, it means wistfully looking back at the past. The dynamic can be seen and felt most sharply sometimes at memorial services. At such ceremonies, we reflect on the times that we might have had with the person we have lost, while simultaneously thinking back wistfully to the times that were before. At memorial services, it is not uncommon to come to the realizations that relationships do not end with death. They are transformed by death. The writer William Faulkner tidily summarized this reality when he wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past. The dead are often ever present in our lives." Has this been your experience? Are there people, family members, possibly even pets, you continue to have important relationships with even though they are dead? It's certainly been my experience. My grandparents, my great aunts, and several deceased mentors and friends are all regularly present in my life. I feel my grandmother Dolores in the kitchen with me just about every time I host a dinner party or even cook dinner for my family. She farmed with my grandfather in Iowa. Embodied what the food critic M.F.K. Fisher has maximed: sharing food with another human being is an intimate act. One of the ways she expressed her love was through the gigantic buffet meals she prepared. There was never just one dish at my grandparents' house. In my memory, there were always at least half a dozen, and all of them homemade. Fresh rolls, homemade pies, mashed potatoes, as well as pickles, chutneys, and jams from her garden, each took their turns gracing the table. She taught my mom to cook. My mom taught me to cook. It's because of my grandmother I'm certain that I both love to make food and to host parties. It is also because of her that I am quite aware that I can never make dinner with just one dish. And then I can also make something that passes as a decent pie crust. When a holiday comes around, I can hear her telling me that a good crust is just the right combination of flaky and tender. Do you have relationships that are similar? Grandparents, parents, friends whose presence you feel whenever you do a particular activity or who inspire you to do a particular thing? Reimagining mourning the past means recognizing that our relationship with the past never ends. The dead continue to influence who we are. Those who have died have never left, runs one of Yosef Barnwell's hymns. This is something I'm acutely aware of as a scholar and religious leader. Some of the most significant relationships in my life have been and continue to be with dead people who I've never even met. Rarely do the political careers of important individuals end in death. The anthropologist David Graeber, who is himself deceased, wrote, "Political figures as ancestors, as founders of institutions can be far more important after their death than they were when they were alive." Jesus was an obscure revolutionary Jewish peasant. He likely only had a few dozen followers during his lifetime. Yet the largest religion in the world has been built around the phrase attributed to him in the Christian New Testament, "Do this in memory of me." Do this in memory of me. Much of what is Christianity can be understood as an effort to reimagine grief. Grief at the loss of Jesus, for certain, but also grief that would have filled the lives of early Christians. Christianity came into being at a time when the average human lifespan was about 40 years. Infant mortality was shockingly high. A quarter of children died before their first birthdays. The political order was brutal, filled with public executions and torture. Legend has it that that was the fate of Paul. Like Jesus, Paul continued to be incredibly important after his death. So much so that much of what is the Christian New Testament either consists of writings by him or attributed to him. The letter to the Hebrews, one of them, was probably not written by Paul, but by someone who, in their own act of mourning, sought to continue the Pauline tradition after his death. It contains a description of the experience of grief and grieving that political and religious dissidents would have found themselves immersed in the Roman Empire. It reports of those who have had to face jeers and flogging, even predators in prison bars, who were stoned to death, put to the sword, deprived, oppressed, ill-treated. The text does not enjoin its readers to give themselves over to grief. Instead, it encourages them to embrace this great cloud of witnesses around us. The words are likely familiar to you. They inspire our own invitation to prayer in the service when we invite you to name those you wish to be held in the embrace of this community. They are a reminder that to participate in or join a religious community is not to just join in fellowship with those who are present. It is to connect our hearts and hands with those who have gone before and those who will come after. To reimagine grief is to be grateful for those who have gone before us. It is to live into the words of Elizabeth Alexander's poem, written for Barack Obama's first inauguration, where she tells us to celebrate and continue the struggle for justice. Say it plain, that many have died for this day. Sing the names of the dead who have brought us here. Sing the names of the dead who have brought us here. The long memory is the most radical idea in America, Clara Sparks said. If you want to understand why critical race theory is so detested here in the state of Texas, that the governor made it illegal for teachers to teach it in public schools, I suggest you start with that quote. Critical race theory is nothing more than the assessment that many of the institutions of the United States and the country itself were originally created for whites. It's the admission that Rice University was founded by William Rice as a school for whites only. It's a confession that the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston may have been one of the first religious communities in the city to desegregate, but it only did so in 1954 after Brown versus the Board of Education. It is an acknowledgement that Jim Crow and racial segregation were not regimes that arose spontaneously as some part of a natural order. They were created through a combination of legislation and violence. It's a profession that race itself is something that only exists because it's been produced to benefit men who believe themselves to be white. It's a declaration that this process has not come to a historical end, but rather continues on as what Michelle Alexander has named the new Jim Crow. It is the analysis that, in her words, we have not ended the racial caste system in America, we've merely redesigned it. Sing the names of the dead who have brought us here. To reimagine mourning the dead is to, again, to invoke the letter of Hebrews, embrace the great cloud of witnesses around us, and then commit to run with the resolution, the race which lies ahead. It is to accept what they dreamed be ours to do, to quote another Unitarian Universalist hymn, and celebrate who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, runs a third hymn. Sing the names of the dead who brought us here. The furor over critical race theory is closely connected to the question of whose names should be remembered and how the dead should be mourned. Should the founders of the Confederacy be held up as heroes to the lost cause, or should they be understood as devotees of white supremacy? Should the country celebrate the heroic Harriet Tubman, who led dozens of people to freedom, on its currency, or should it lionize Andrew Jackson, who enslaved hundreds? To reimagine mourning the past is to understand that these questions are not historical curiosities. It is instead to recognize that the work that people do in our relationships with them continue after their death. Salute Jackson, and we lift up the brutality and white supremacy of as nation. Salute Jackson, and we lift up white supremacy as the nation's cardinal virtues. Honor Tubman and create, in Elizabeth Alexander's words, a praise song for walking forward into that light, where the creation of a multiracial democracy and economic justice is understood to be the order of the day. Sing the names of the dead who brought us here. To reimagine mourning the past is to recognize that what we have done throughout this sermon. The past is never dead. It's not even past, as Faulkner told us. To reimagining mourning the past is to admit that we are always surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. It matters a great deal who we populate that cloud with, whom we celebrate, and how we come to understand those who have gone before us. To reimagine mourning the past is to come to understand that there is never one moment when we are relevant and another moment when we are irrelevant. It is instead to understand that we are all part of the great communion, struggling onwards, each influencing and continuing to influence what is to come, whether it be through the baking of pies with tender pastry crusts or the great struggle for freedom. That it might be so, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.